Once again, good evening, and of course, I want to welcome you. I want to welcome everybody for another session of our cybersecurity training. And of course, this is K2 Cyber Tech. My name is Professor Mbuna, as bloody called by most students and so on. And of course, this is going to be what I call week one, and of course, session one of our cybersecurity training. And usually, many people who get into information system security officer, sometimes it is their first time, sometimes they get in by curiosity, and sometimes they're a little bit nervous not knowing exactly what type of skills they want to or they will acquire. Sometimes they feel that, hey, when I get in there, I am going to be so techy and so on. I am going to have a lot of hands-on that I am going to be studying and so on. But again, Information System Security Officer is part of cybersecurity. Again, it falls under the umbrella of cybersecurity. But again, it might not share require you to be so technical, like, for example, being a Linux system administrator, being a DevOps or DevSecOps guy, or being a cloud security engineer. But again, though you might not be heavily invested when it comes to hands-on, that does not cancel the fact that, again, you should be familiar with all those technical skills because at one point, you are actually going to be communicating with people across different industries or across different departments. That should have been the right word in your organization that you work for. So again, we are going to take this gradually, and in the course of going through each concept that we have to review today, there are different other things that may come up, and of course, we might actually go through it. Once again, this is Professor Bona speaking, and of course, this is K2 Cybertech, and I want to welcome you. Please, you can feel free to take your notes wherever you are. Make sure that you take your note. That is going to help you ease understanding. So now we are going to talk, we are actually in week one, session one, cybersecurity governance and the federal landscape. Of course, that is one of the things we are going to be looking at. So again, in this first week and the first session, we're going to be establishing the foundation of what we are going to be looking ahead. And so this is just a session roadmap. So what is the roadmap we are going to be having ahead of us? First, what we are going to cover today, we have to look at why risk management framework was born and the history and the problem it actually came to solve. Now, again, in this week's Nist reading, because I organize the classes in such a way that there will be every week or every session, there should be at least a Nist documentation that students will be encouraged to read. Some of this documentation are lengthy, and we might not actually have to read them at work during training. But again, I will highly encourage you that you Google this documentation and read them because they are going to help you. So we're also going to be talking about topics covered. We are going to look at the cost per FISMAN, OMB, 30. We are going to look at what I call the NIST hierarchy, rules, and even the scorecards and so on. Main discussions, questions, if there will happen to be any, and of course, what we are expecting again, or my expectation for you as students or learners, again, for this first week right here. So again, before we move to the next session, or before coming to the next session of the training, at least make sure that you Google and you get yourself familiarized with FISMAN 44 USC, and of course 3551 and so on. And you can actually go skim through it. You don't really need to spend much time to understand what that means as if you were a legislator and so on. But again, I just want you to know that there is actually a legislative or law or that is actually behind this job that we are doing, and so on. We also have the OMB, which is, I think, comes from the Office of Management and Budget, Circular A 130, which of course establishes the focus on cybersecurity for the federal government. And we have Nist SP 800 37, and more precisely, Ref 2. You can read the full documentation, which is highly recommended, and of course, which is, of course, your risk management framework roadmap. And the second documentation or that you have to read for this week, for the first session of this training this week, is to focus on the NIST SP 853 Ref 5, Chapter 1, Chapter 2, is recommended, but that is not the only chapter whereby you can limit your attention right there. So now, before we even go further to talk about things like the risk management framework and so on, it is very important that we understand exactly what some of these rules are. It is very important we understand the definition of some of these rules, because if you don't understand uh, some of these rules, again, it can be a little bit confusing, because these rules, again, are people that you are going to be interacting with and so on. And some of these rules are not fully listed here. These are just some of them. But as we go ahead in this class, we are going to be looking at other rules that are related to these ones. The first one we are going to talk about here is we are going to be talking about the CIO, right? So again, the CIO is the Chief Information Officer, and who that is the equivalent to what I would call the CEO. So what actually his function is within that organization that you are going to be supporting is that he or she actually is responsible for the agency-wide IT strategy, budget management, ensures that FISMA compliance security program actually exists. So I will say he is the main gatekeeper of security in that particular agency right there. So his role is to make sure that security is actually implemented. Now we talk about the top to bottom, right? Security implementation. So he watches over that. So after him, or another role that you are going to likely encounter is going to be what I call the Senior Agency Information Security Officer. And of course, it is one of the senior leadership roles that you are going to see, especially within the federal agency. Now, these roles are very common within the federal agency because risk management framework was designed specifically for agencies, federal agencies within the United States. Now, that doesn't mean because it was designed specifically for them, other countries or other organizations cannot use them. As a matter of fact, the NIST, National Institute for Standard of and Technology, that is responsible for these publications, they have designed different set of policies and procedures, not just in cybersecurity, but in other areas that actually will help you to be able to fully understand or effectively implement security and so on. So we just spoke about the CIO, and we spoke about the Senior Agency Information Security Officer. And now we can talk about, again, the ease of Information System Security Officer as you are. Of course, being an information system security officer as you are going to be relating with different roles. Now, please let me raise this very clear to you. And why am I bringing these roles to you? Now, again, in some organizations, they have a structure in place whereby, as the ISO, you cannot directly communicate. You cannot directly communicate to most of the top leaders right there. So please listen for me and listen very well. So again, it depends again per agency. You cannot just live as an ISO and then you break the chain of authority and then you just send an email. Hey, maybe you need something, you need clarification, you need an artifact. You go and you are asking it directly from the CIO or the CIO or any of those top leaders out there. I mean, you are PM, ITPM, they may not actually look at it very positively. You might think it is okay, but again, every organization, they have their rules of engagement. It's better off for you to know this upfront than to make all these mistakes and so on. So again, the information system security officer is just that person that we are going to be talking and focusing most of his role in this particular training. And again, in addition to the mentioned titles such as the CIO, or maybe looking at the senior agency information security officer, again, you are going to hear other common terminology such as the authorizing official, right? Authorizing official, usually AO. You are going to hear things like information system owner, which the ISO will interact with them all the time. You are going to hear things like the security control assessors and many others that you are going to come across or you are going to be working with and so on. So again, it's not just one title, but those are the common or the most common titles that you actually are going to hear most of the time again as we progress in this course, or if you happen to be in the field, you are going to hear these titles over and over. Now, let's talk about this major important aspect. I always tell students one thing, and I always tell myself one thing. The best way for you to understand a technology is to ask yourself the question, what did that technology come to do? What did that come to solve? Because if a technology, a particular tool or software exists, it comes to solve a particular problem. So if you can therefore have that mindset whenever you are talking about technology or talking about any software or any program, then it means that your comprehension is going to be faster than that of anybody or somebody who just want to memorize without actually fully understanding exactly the full context right there. So we are going to be talking about this concept. Why was risk management framework actually born? That is just the problem right there. Why was it even born in the first place? So we are going to be talking about the problem it replaced because there was a problem that a risk management framework actually came to replace in the cyberspace and more specifically within government agencies. It was coming to solve the problem. Now, first, before risk management framework, the federal system went through what they call C&A accreditation, which was a formal review process, which we are going to break down as we move forward. So that was just basically what was there. That's what they call the C&A. And sometimes when you go on job boards, you might see some people use the word C&A. How do you think they are wrong? Technically, they are not wrong because that was the name right there. Logically, it can be a little bit misleading because, again, that name has long been eroded and, of course, replaced by a more mature framework of looking at things. Now, the CNA, as I'm going to call it quite often, was a point in time review. That is, a system was assessed, it was accredited, and then largely left alone for years. Okay. It was left alone for years. And that was just the main problem with that framework that we had. Now, it doesn't mean that it was totally different from what we are going to see. It's just that the philosophy and the mindset was absolutely very, very wrong, and that opened up a lot of gaps for vulnerabilities right there. So again, it was repeated roughly every 3 years, with little to no insight into the system's actual problem in between. So again, there was a lot of vulnerabilities right there, which we are going to explore as we move gradually. Now, the result, the systems could be secure on paper, of course, the day of accreditation, but dangerously out of date and so on. Now, this is just very simple. Okay. Using this particular visualization right here. Just imagine that a system gets its accreditation on year, the first year, right here. So the first year, the system is going to get its accreditation. Okay. Now, when it gets its accreditation the first year, and that is it. They just say, okay, let's forget about the system. On paper, it shows that the system is secure. But in actual fact, is the system secure? Yes, it is secure from day one when it got its authorization to operate. But now, throughout, again, is it actually secured? Well, maybe from year one, maybe from the first day of being secured to the first year. I mean, there are some software that have actually likely been depreciated, or there are some applications that needs updates, and that, of course, they have had different vulnerabilities and so on. And maybe the vendors have released different vulnerabilities and patches for those particular applications or those particular systems and so on. But again, the fact that the assumption was that once secured, it remains secured every 3 years before they come back and check. So now you see year one, a vulnerability is introduced. Year two, a vulnerability is introduced. Year three, a vulnerability can be introduced right there. So now it is at the end of the year three, again, that they start thinking about, hey, let's go and check. Let's go and see if this system is still secure. Technically, on paper, it says that this system is secured, but actually, the system that is running is not actually secured. It's a big problem right there. Now, let me bring it a little bit, let me break it down with a very simple example. When you buy a car, you go to the motor vehicle administration. It doesn't matter if the car is new or the car is not new. You have to go through what they call the pre-assessment phase, okay? Which your car has to go through different assessment. And once your assessment passes, then that is when you can go to MVA after you get your driver's license, and that car can be permitted to run on the highway. Technically speaking and logically speaking, the car without having gone through an assessment so that the Department of Transportation can determine if that car is fit will not actually be permitted to run on the way, especially if that is a car that is just being bought or maybe being registered with somebody's name and so on. So why are they doing so? It's because they want to make sure that that car is safe enough for the safety of everybody. Now, guess what? When you get into a particular, that car passes a security assessment and it goes to the road. Now, it doesn't, the Department of Transportation does not assume that because it has passed its initial security check, the car is always going to be secure. You will see once in a while, maybe depending on the state of the car that was assessed, maybe in particular year one or year two, they might send you an email or a letter to the mail telling you that, hey, it's time for emission and so on. Why? Why do you think that the Department of Transportation does all those things? Is to make sure that they have absolute control and awareness of your car to make sure that your car is actually in good state and for the security of everyone. So if your car has a check engine on, then it's not going to pass when it goes through emission. What happens is that they will fail you and they will ask you to go and do repairs on the car. If you don't do repairs on the car, you come back the next month, they will fail you. And they will keep on sending you every month. You come back there and do repairs, you do inspection or emissions on that particular car. Now, if you see that if you repair the check engine and any other problem on the dashboard, you are going to pass inspection or emission, and you might not come back for the next maybe few months, 6 months, 1 year, and so on. Now, that is the same philosophy that is taking place right here within the concept of an information system. When a computer or a server is actually acquired But in a government agency, they don't just plug it to the wall and they start using it like that. Things don't work like that. So what happens is that it has to go through different levels and stages of hardening. What do we mean by stages of hardening? In other words, we have what we call layer security that needs to be applied to it. In other words, the security needs to come and harden that again, we will believe that, or everybody will say, okay, this layer of security has been applied to this system. It is going to be very difficult for this system to actually be hacked by the bad guys. And so, particular framework that has been put in place is now called the risk management framework. The earlier attempt to do so was through what they call the CNA, which of course that was a very I would not say bad, but it was not rigorous enough. The process was not as strategic, strong, and secure as the current version of the risk management framework. So, which simply means that you see, when a system, for example, year one was set to again, it has passed a security check or benchmark, then they will allow it right there, and they will only come after 3 years to say, okay, let's reassess back this system right here. So, again, we are still talking on the concept of why risk management was actually born. Why was it born? Again, we have seen that before it was born, there was another framework concept that was in place. Now, let's look at how the different agencies and other issues that was faced right there. Number one, we talk about fragmentation across the government agencies. Well, if I'm not mistaken, this is just an estimate. The US government, as of today, may have about 418 agencies. I'm just estimating, so don't take my word for it. You can actually Google without actually including sub agencies, right? Now, just imagine, for example, that if the US government has about 480 agencies and so on. Now, the question is if every agency has to have their own cybersecurity program. Now, do you think that they are going to be unanimous or they are going to be in one accord across different agencies? Obviously, no. Because again, when we talk about cybersecurity at a generic level, we can call it cybersecurity, but when it comes to implementation, people have different ideologies and philosophies on how cybersecurity should be implemented. So now the fragmentation came because many agencies in the United States, they had their own concept and their philosophy of what cybersecurity was all about. Now we have what we call the Department of Defense, which of course is one of the big guns when it comes to the agencies in the United States. Now they had a program, their cybersecurity framework was actually called BitStab, right? And it was later replaced by what they call DICAP. That's just their framework right there. So again, they had their own version or their framework. Now, on the other hand, we have what they call the national security system. They actually run a separate process called NICAP right there. So we have several agencies, each had their own variation of what cybersecurity was all about. So again, the main problem is that they never had a shared vocabulary. What do I mean by a shared vocabulary? They never had a common language that they could actually speak, which means that, hey, if you ask the 480 agencies what is cybersecurity, everybody will tell you what cybersecurity is according to their opinion, according to their definition. But are they going to be wrong? No, they are not going to be wrong. Why? Because again, cybersecurity had no official standard to hold everybody accountable for it, and so on. It's just like the tale. There's a famous tale. We call that the elephant. I think the tale of the elephant and the blind man. The blind man and the elephant. That is the right thing I was looking for. Now, the blind man and the elephant. So, one blind man happens to touch the leg of an elephant and struggle to wrap itself around the leg is so huge. And so that man says, hey, an elephant is a tree. Yes, of course, an elephant is a tree. Now, is he wrong? Technically, he's not wrong. Why? Because that is what he was able to feel. One other person touches the ear of an elephant. He says, hey, an elephant is a leaf. Why? Because the ear was soft and it looks flat like a broad or gigantic leaf. That is what the person is going to think about it. Now, one person touches the tusk of an elephant. It says, no, the elephant is like a spear. Now, what touches the tail? Maybe it touches just maybe the end of the tail and says, no, it's like a broom fiber or something of this nature. So it gives a different description. The question is, are they wrong? No, none of them are wrong. But is the description they are giving, does it fit an elephant? Not at all. An elephant is just an animal. So now you see the problem that the US government had. And it became a serious issue because the government was like, okay, now we need to have a solution to this, and so on. And again, that is the reason why risk management, therefore, had to be birthed because of the necessity to be able to have a standardization across different agencies. And one other point we need to talk about right here is what I call a system moving between agencies was reassessed completely from scratch, wasting time and money. So again, this becomes a nightmare. Okay, it becomes a
Mhm.
nightmare. Now, let's assume, for example, that you have a car and you are living in one state, and that car has been assessed by the Department of Transportation, and you have been given a license and everything, you are actually okay. But now, when you go to another state that is still in the same country, they want you again to start driving from scratch. You have to go to MVA, you have to take the computer test, you have to do everything from scratch again. Now, do you think that sounds fair? Not obviously. Why? Because it is a waste of time. So you see, that is almost similar concept here that the government actually faced, which means that if one system has been in one agency approved and accredited, what happens is that if that system has to move to another agency, the agency is going to say, well, we agree that it was approved. We don't argue about it. But in this agency, this is how we see cybersecurity. This is how we define cybersecurity. As a result, again, it's going to waste time, it's going to waste resources because it has to be assessed. If a system took maybe 1 year to be assessed, then you can imagine, therefore, the time it would take, therefore, for that system to be reassessed before it can actually be authorized right there to actually operate in that new agency. So these are some of the obstacles. These are some of the constraints. These are some of the bloggers that actually necessitated the need for risk management framework to actually be born so that it's going to unify the entire agency that we have the same vocabulary to speak. Again, we are talking about the need why risk management was indeed born. So in this summary here, we are going to see what which I just explained earlier on. First, the DoD had started with what they call the DSCAP, and later on it went to DICAP and so on. But now, again, from 2024, again, a change came in. Now they had to go with one framework that is called the NIST SP 837. So it's no longer that, hey, the DoD will be using but the DICAP, we are going to be using NIST SP 800 right there. The national security systems, they were using NICAP. Now, in this case, therefore, all of them are subject to the same catalog, right? One control catalog, which is called the NIST SP 853, used both by the national security systems or used by the DoD. Civilian agencies, dozens of local variants, they had variation and so on. So now they have a shared concept, which is called the shared categorization using the Federal Information Processing Standard FIPS 199 and also what they call the XP 860, which we are going to see when we start talking about information system categorization. Now we talk about no common control baseline existed before 2024. But right now, we have a common baseline which is enabled and so on. There are many controls depending on your system. It will define how much control, how many controls you will need right there, and so on. Now, finally or lastly, a system changing agency started over and over. That was just a serious pain right there. Time wastage, financial wastage. But right now, there is what they call reciprocity becomes possible for the first time. So now you see that risk management framework came therefore as a savior to actually change a lot of things. So again, if you did cybersecurity, in quote, the concept of risk management framework within federal agencies, before 2014, it was most likely that you actually really, must have come across some of the experiences I am describing. But if you are a newer generation after 2014, a lot of things actually change and so on. And that is why you see that need, ISO, and so on, they were so hot in demand during this particular period right here. Why? Because there was that need to have people that understand the old school way and the new school way, the way I'm going to call it. So, again, that was just simply talking about exactly how it was born, again, the different issues it faced. Now, let's talk about why it was born at the level of legislative push, right? Now, FISMA demands a standard. Of course, the standardization is what we have agreed that standardization was going to solve a lot of problems of the past. But now, how therefore was that going to work? It started with what they call the FISMA, of course, which was first of all passed in the year 2002, and of course later on modernized in 2014, especially with the coming of cloud technology and so on. So again, 2002 became actually one of those turning points whereby legislative which became absolutely very necessary in order to break loose from the old system that was not working and so on. And of course, it was in place, and finally, everything was mostly modernized by the year 2014, which required a more standardized, risk-based approach government-wide, just as we saw in the previous section. So again, Nist answered in 2004 with, of course, the Nist SP 837, and the first version of what would become the risk management framework actually was conceived. In around 2010, Nist overhauled the Nist 837 into the six steps of risk management framework, replacing the one-time accreditation with continuous risk management, and so on. Again, this wasn't a technical upgrade. It was a legally mandated shift in philosophy and so on. So again, you have to see that every agency were forced to comply because it was a legislative push that came from above to all the agencies and so on. So again, from law to framework, the push to risk management framework. The FISMA enacted standardization approach was around 2002. Again, around 2004, Nist developed the Nist SP 137, which was published and so on, which was the first landmark which existed around that period. And of course, we had around 2010, again, the six steps of the risk management framework was actually born, which is one of the things that we are going to be seeing in this particular training session. And if in 2014, we have what they call the FISMA modernization. Of course, the DoD now adopted risk management framework and so on. So you have the references there. You can actually Google that to fit your curiosity. Now, in 2018, we have therefore the NIST SP 800. Remember, the SP stands for Special Publication 800 slash 37. We have REF. REF stands for revision because we have different revision. So as of 2018, per our discussion right now, of course, they've had to prepare steps and privacy added and so on. Remember that as of recording of this particular train, this is actually 2026. So it's most likely that by the moment that you've come across this video wherever, then you might not be again, or we might not actually still be on Ref 2. Why? Because most of this NIST documentation are considered as living documents. So again, now coming there for why it was born, the DoD adoption, one framework, one government, right here. In 2014, the DoD instruction 510.01 formally enters the DICAP. Again, a common framework across the DoD and so on. And of course, again, as we explained earlier on, gradually things are going to change from the previous version itself. So again, what is soft, which of course we already saw that risk management framework came with a shared vocabulary. Again, shared vocabulary in what sense? I'm not saying linguistic vocabulary in terms of speaking English versus English, French versus French. No, that is not what I'm trying to say right here. The shared vocabulary here simply means, again, in terms of control families, they were classified, every control were actually classified under families. They had a specific baseline and they had a categorization levels that was understood the same way everywhere. For example, if your system is a low system, it doesn't matter where you are operating. As far as you fall within the federal agency, the same baselines are going to apply. For example, if they say, okay, under maybe Ref 5, and you need maybe 200 security control for any system that is a baseline system in terms of their categorization, it doesn't matter. You know that for you to be able to meet that baseline, you must have at least 200 security controls implemented. If they say, okay, the baseline for moderate system is about 360 security controls, well, it doesn't matter which agency you are, but in as much as your system has been assessed and says your system is moderate, then at least the baseline that everybody expects to see, the government expects to see, is that you should have about maybe 360 if that is agreed upon. Now, if your system is maybe critical or high, and they say the minimum controls you have is about 480, I'm just giving an estimation right now. I mean, I'm not quite exactly sure how much baseline control is there, but this is just an example I'm giving right now for learning purpose. Now, you see, the shared vocabulary require that every system that is already categorized at this categorization must have the same level of baseline security right there. This is just exactly one of the things that it came to solve and so on. That shared vocabulary, again, came to solve a lot of problems, which some of them we already identified previously. Now, most importantly, again, one of the deficiencies of the previous CNA's accreditation process was that with the process just came and established what I call a static point in points, again, assessment, paper security right there. That is when I can really call it paper security, because once a system was assessed, the people actually show that this system is actually secure. But again, from the period of the first year to the third year, many things may happen to the system. And that is when the bad guys means that they had a lot of opportunity to take over a particular system. Why? Because a lot of software are out of date, a lot of programs are no longer needed, and so on. So again, you can just imagine how the bad guys could take advantage of. Let me just give a very simple example. Right now, most people are using Windows 11. Okay, just imagine that a system was assessed maybe few weeks or few days before Windows 10 was actually discontinued, or not discontinued, or support was discontinued for Windows 10. And a company had most of their servers or their systems running on Windows 10, and they just finished the assessment. And 1 week later, Microsoft says, okay, as of today, we no longer provide support for Windows Server or Windows OS, maybe version 10, and so on. and you are having it within your organization. So you will have to wait until the 3 year cycle before you can think of upgrading it to Windows 11. So the question is, what happens in between the 360 something years? Now you now see how much you are going to really, really screw up. You are going to mess up completely that particular security practice right there. So again, risk management framework came to solve a lot of problems. And these problems that it came actually to solve, again, again, is so important and so crucial that you, as an information system security officer in training, you should have this back history at the back of your mind. If you don't have this history, then it can be a very serious problem right there for you. Now we are still talking about why it was born. And one of the things we're going to talk about is how a shared vocabulary enables a reuse and so on. And this is not so different from what I already explained. But again, looking at my diagram right here, so we talk about shared vocabulary, which means that, again, every agency, we have to use the same vocabulary, the same control manual, and so on. The same control families, the same baseline, the same categorization, the same control inheritance, and agency reciprocity, and so on. This is just a summation right here of that shared vocabulary that we just spoke. So now, where is the standard today? Where are we standing today? Yes, we have just spoken about where we were yesterday. Where are we standing today? Today, of course, I'm not talking about the date of today, but I'm talking about the present stage of this security framework and its maturity. We are being recorded, or this session is being recorded in 2026. And of course, most of these documentations have actually been improved so much. And of course, most of the revisions are either on revision 1, revision 2, or even on revision 5, and so on, right? And of course, again, we have what we call the FedRAMP. The FedRAMP also is another modernization program into the cloud that has matured so tremendously from where we are today and so on. And again, a lot of things have matured and a lot of things are moving towards automation right now. So that is why it's going to be so unfair if you are just having a career as an ISO or thinking about a career as an ISO and you are thinking about traditional security without actually adding cloud right there and so on. Why? Because you may find yourself in a system or in an agency whereby you are being given a system whereby you find yourself having a system that is hosted in cloud. And again, you are going to come face to face with the concept of FedRAMP right there. So again, as I was saying, the ecosystem today, we have a lot of automation that is coming in to help a lot of things move forward. Nist SP 837, we have Red 4. We have things like the FedRAMP, which itself has been burned already. We have things like the OSCAR, machine readable risk management framework documentation. We have a lot of things too. There are different tools that are now being used by different agencies. For example, EMAS, we have things like CSAM, we have things like ZACTA. I mean, there are so many of these tools that are being used by different agencies today. So the bottom line, before and after risk management framework, as a takeaway from what we have just been talking about is, of course, the CNA era, certification and accreditation era, was of course a point in time review whereby they had to review the system just at one point and they had to wait for the 3 years circle for them to go back right there. And so the change that we now have with risk management framework is what I call continuous risk-based monitoring. So again, it is a continuous process throughout. So again, if you were an ISO before 2014, it means that again, once your system has been assessed, you go to work, you don't have anything to do. Unless and you wait until 3 years or when the system is assessed, they fire you, and when they're about to reassess the system, they hire you. So That was just simply how it was. And the job market also was a little bit unstable. I mean, that's my prediction. Okay. I mean, you can Google it right there and compare the job market of an ISO back then before 2014 and also right now, 2000, oh, and after 2014. But now we now require what they call a continual risk-based monitoring, which means that you don't just fold your arms as an ISO, you go to work and you say, my system has been accredited. Yes, it has been accredited, but your day-to-day job is going to be dealing with what they call risk-based monitoring. You are going to be monitoring risk based from different perspective. It might be from vulnerability, day-to-day management. It might be some of your artifacts that are coming to expire very soon. It can be your SSP that needs to be updated. It can be that your BIA needs to be updated. It might be that your CPT is coming. So there are so many other things again to talk about right here. So in the past, we had again the CNA era. We talk about fragmentation across DoD and so on. But in this modern era, we are talking about one framework across all of the government agencies. Now, in the past, we talk about shared control catalog, but now we are now talking about shared control catalog as there was no shared control catalog before 2014. But after 2014, which is now in quote, we now have a control catalog which we can use. Again, reassessment on every agency move. If you have to go from one agency to the other, there was a reassessment. But right now, it is no longer so. Everything can be inherited and so on. And reciprocity is also very, very possible. And of course, lastly, again, the CNA era, they had little insight between the review cycles. And of course, the real-time posture visibility was a major issue right there, and so on. So again, that was just simply then. And let's try to the misconception about the concept of risk management framework is just paperwork. Because sometimes I've heard a lot of people try to make mockery of ISOs and say an ISO work is just paperwork. That is just people who look it from the outside and so on. If you have not been in the system, you will not actually know exactly how it works. You need to be in the system for you to fully understand exactly what, again, this is all about. Now, again, first of all, the criticism isn't baseless. Of course, if they say it's paper security or other risk management framework is just paper. Yes, okay. But now let's go further. Risk management framework is a documentation heavy because you are going to be working with a lot of documents and so on. So again, for you to be an ISO, please make sure that you learn how to use a Microsoft Word, learn how to use a Excel, learn how to use a PowerPoint, because those are going to be your technical documents in quote and so on. So again, it requires heavy documentation, and of course, an ATO timelines are still very, very slow. Now, on the other hand, but compared to what it replaced, risk management frameworks paperwork produces a shared, reusable, continued monitoring record. That is just the good thing right there. Even though it is heavy paperwork, but most of it can be reused and so on. It's reusable. Okay, that is the good thing right there. So again, the CNA generation produced a paperwork, of course, one-time snapshot that was often stale before the ink dried and so on. So again, purely paperwork right there under the CNA generation. And the honest answer, risk management framework created one kind of overhead for much more valuable kind of visibility. Yes, the language might sound a little bit ambiguous, but as we continue, then you will be able to learn a lot of things right there. So again, I'm going to lay that emphasis that risk management framework, yes, even though it is paper, but that does not mean that it is just as paper as you think. Again, it's not as paper as you think, not when everything was modernized from 2014 and on. So, again, discussion one. What would federal cybersecurity look like today if DoD, the civilian agencies, and the intelligence community had never adopted a common framework? Of course, this is just a school of thought, a school of food for thought. I don't expect you to answer me on this, but again, you can answer yourself, you can do your research. But again, if you have been following what we have just been explaining, you would therefore imagine the cacophony or the disorder that would have existed and the number of cybersecurity breaches that we count on daily basis. Now, discussion two. Risk management framework is often criticized as paper heavy. What did it get right compared to what came before it? And where do you think that criticism is still fair today? Okay. Yes, it has been fair for the past years. Before 2014, I would say it was 95% fair, but from 2014 and up, again, I would say it was almost like 75% fair, but now a lot of automation is being introduced and so on. Again, that automation is going to reduce a lot of stuff, especially now that AI is being integrated in a lot of stuff. So again, paper is still going to be inevitable under managerial control, but again, it's going to reduce the burden that was used to look into a lot of security requirement, control, and so on. So again, we have looked into just exactly the history of what that CNA was and actually where we are actually standing today. And I hope that this was actually very, very enlightening for those of you that are planning to actually become, of course, uh, information system security officer.